Today, we will explore one of the most fascinating and mysterious stories in Scripture, the dispute between the archangel Michael and Satan over the body of Moses. A unique event which is only mentioned in Jude 1 verse 9, and which leads us to question what really happened behind the spiritual scenes. Why did Satan fight for Moses' body? And why was it necessary for Michael, one of the most powerful angels, to get involved in a confrontation with the devil himself? In this video, we will learn details about this spiritual battle, exploring the powerful lessons of faith, divine authority, and submission that this story teaches us. Prepare yourself for a deep reflection on the power of God in our lives and how He gives us victory over the forces of evil. If you're ready to understand more about this celestial confrontation, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Let's go on this journey of spiritual discovery together. The first question that arises is, why would the devil have fought for Moses' body? Although we don't have a definitive explanation in the Bible, many scholars and commentators suggest that Satan wanted Moses' body for several possible reasons. One theory is that he wanted to build a sanctuary or place of worship around Moses' bones so that the people of Israel would turn to him in worship. This would have been an attempt to divert the attention of God's people to a form of idolatry. In response, Michael, as a defender of God's people, would have fought against Satan to protect the memory of Moses and prevent that place from becoming a center of idolatry. However, the true reason for the dispute over Moses' body remains a mystery. Some suggest that the reason is linked to the fact that Moses was such an important figure in the history of Israel. He was the leader who freed the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt and led them to the border of the Promised Land. Therefore, Satan, who always tries to corrupt God's creation, could have wanted to control something as powerful as Moses' legacy, turning his body into a symbol of undue worship. This confrontation between Michael and Satan gives us a glimpse into the spiritual battlefield that takes place in unseen realities, where every action has a purpose far greater than we can understand. The book of Daniel also makes reference to Michael as the prince protector of Israel. In Daniel 10 verse 21, we see the archangel Gabriel talking about helping Michael in spiritual battles against evil principalities. Yet I will declare to you what is recorded in the book of truth. There is no one to help me against those princes, except Michael their prince. This suggests that Michael plays an essential role not only in protecting God's people, but also in direct confrontations with demonic forces. The fact that Michael was chosen to fight Satan over the body of Moses reflects his leadership role in spiritual battles and his divine authority over the forces of evil. The death of Moses, as mentioned in the scriptures, is shrouded in mystery. We know he died at the age of 120, but the Bible also tells us that his eyes did not fail, nor did his strength diminish. This gives us an idea that Moses was in full physical health, even at his advanced age, when he was called to leave this world. Moses, a man of great faith and leadership, was prevented from entering the Promised Land due to his disobedience at Meribah, where he struck the rock instead of speaking to it as God had commanded. This marks a sad part of his story, but also an important lesson about the consequences of disobedience, even for God's greatest leaders. Even in the face of his disobedience, Moses was granted one last glimpse of the Promised Land, a consolation for the end of his journey. God took him to the top of Mount Nebo in Moab, where he beheld the land that had been promised to the Israelites, but which he would never set foot on. Mount Pisgah, which Moses climbed, is 370 meters high, and the climb up there must have been quite a challenge for a 120-year-old man. However, Moses, even at an advanced age and lacking the strength for the journey, reached the top, demonstrating his perseverance and faith until the end. This act of climbing the mountain alone and without help is a symbol of the inner strength he possessed, sustained by trust in God. When Moses reached the top and saw his vision of the Promised Land, he knew his time had come. God had informed him that he was about to pass away and that Joshua would be the new leader of Israel. Moses then experienced a moment of relief, as the weight of the responsibility of leading the people was lifted from his shoulders. During the 40 years that he led the Israelites through the desert, Moses faced immense challenges, and the responsibility of guiding an entire nation was a burden that he carried with great courage. However, in the end, he knew that his mission was complete and that his role was being passed on to the next generation. Moses' death was a lonely, but also peaceful passage. The book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 34, describes that Moses died according to the word of the Lord and was buried by God in a place that no one would ever know. The Bible tells us that God buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses is the only person in the Bible that God personally buried, which adds even more mystery and reverence to his end. The fact that God buried Moses in secret, without allowing anyone to know where the tomb was, is significant and carries a spiritual lesson about humility and respect for divine work. The reason God hid Moses' burial place is a topic that generates much debate among scholars. One possible explanation is that if the burial location had been known, the Israelites could have turned Moses' tomb into a place of worship and idolatry. The human tendency to venerate important figures may have led to worship practices that God wanted to avoid. If Moses' tomb were a public place, it could easily become a center of worship, something that would be contrary to God's teachings, which require exclusive worship of him. The secrecy of his burial site, therefore, was a way of protecting the people of Israel from falling into idolatry. The fact that Moses' tomb was hidden by God is an action that demonstrates divine care for the people of Israel and their protection against practices that could divert faith from the true God. If Moses' tomb had been found and become a sanctuary, the worship of Moses might have replaced the worship of God himself. So God did what was necessary to ensure that the people of Israel were not led into this. Divine protection over Moses' body and the attempt to prevent any type of idolatry are also a reminder that God has a greater purpose that goes beyond human understanding, and that he acts to protect his people from all evil. However, the battle over Moses' body between Michael and Satan raises a fundamental question. Why was Satan so interested in Moses' body? A possible explanation for the dispute is that Satan wanted to use Moses' body to corrupt the leader's memory and divert the attention of the people of Israel. Moses was a central figure in the history of Israel, and his leadership was crucial to the people's liberation from slavery in Egypt. Satan, as the enemy of God and humanity, wanted to destroy the sanctity and divine purpose behind Moses' life and legacy. The battle over Moses' body, then, can be seen as Satan's attempt to attack salvation history and the continuity of God's covenant with his people. In Jude 1 verse 9, we see Michael not fighting Satan on the basis of his own authority, but in the name of the Lord. Even though he was an archangel, Michael did not take control of the situation, but left God to be responsible for responding to the enemy. This attitude of Miguel is an example of humility and obedience. He, like all angels, knows that his authority comes directly from God, and he submits to that authority without question. In doing so, Michael teaches us an important lesson, that even in our spiritual struggles, we must always depend on God and never rely on our own strength. The battle in heaven that is described in Revelation 12, where Michael and his angels fight the dragon, is also connected to the ongoing struggle between the forces of good and evil. Satan, the dragon, represents all demonic forces that oppose God and his people. The fight is described as intense, but as always, Satan and his angels do not prevail. They are defeated and expelled from heaven. This victory of Michael over Satan is a symbol of authority and power of God over the forces of evil. Even in the midst of difficult spiritual battles, we know that God is sovereign and that the final victory will be his. Michael's role as a spiritual warrior is a recurring theme in the Bible. In Daniel, Jude, and Revelation, he is described as a defender of God's people, fighting against evil principalities. Its presence in these passages reminds us that spiritual struggle is real, and that there are unseen forces working against God's plan. However, Michael, with the help of the heavenly hosts, is an assurance that God is in control and that in the end, he will always prevail. Michael's presence as a leader in the heavenly battles also highlights the importance of obedience and submission to God, who is the source of all spiritual authority. The word archangel used to describe Michael means angel of the highest rank, which indicates his leadership position among the angels. Most of the angels mentioned in the Bible are described as messengers, but Michael is portrayed as a war leader, someone who actively opposes the forces of evil. This makes him a unique figure in the angelic hierarchy. His leadership position also reflects the importance of submission to God in all things. Even with his great authority, Michael does not act independently, but always under the direction of God, which teaches us the importance of recognizing our position before God and always acting in accordance with his will. The name Michael means who is like God, a question that highlights divine authority. The implication is clear. No one is like God, and Michael, as archangel, is an extension of God's sovereignty. In fighting Satan and his forces, Michael does not act in the name of his own strength, but in the name of God, the Creator and Redeemer. Michael's humility in submitting to God, despite his great power, is an example for all of us. He teaches us that, to be true winners in the spiritual struggle, we must recognize our total dependence on God. Lucifer, before becoming Satan, was created as the highest creature in heaven. He was the most beautiful and the most powerful angel, but his arrogance and desire to be equal to God led to his downfall. This is an important lesson about the danger of self-sufficiency and trying to rival divine authority. The fall of Lucifer and his transformation into Satan shows that even the most powerful creatures must recognize the supremacy of God. Michael, in opposing Satan, does so not on the basis of his own authority, but in the name of God, showing that true strength comes from humility and obedience to God. The lesson we can learn from Miguel's stance is profound. Many Christians, despite professing faith in God, still have difficulty bowing before him. Michael teaches us that true spiritual strength does not come from arrogance or self-sufficiency, but from humility and recognition of our position before God. When fighting Satan, Michael shows us that even in the face of the greatest spiritual difficulties, we must always depend on God, as he is the source of all strength and victory. Our submission to him does not weaken us, but strengthens us. Michael's spiritual battle against Satan reminds us that although Christians are called to spiritual warfare, our victory depends not on our own strength, but on God's authority. When we face temptations and spiritual challenges, we must remember that the fight is not ours, but God's. Like Michael, we need to submit completely to God's will and fight based on his authority. In doing so, we can have confidence that, as they did in heaven, the forces of evil will not prevail against us. The battle in heaven, described in Revelation 12, also reminds us of God's final victory over Satan and his angels. Although Satan still has power and influence in the world, his defeat is assured. The spiritual warfare we see in Revelation is a reflection of an ongoing struggle, but also of the promise that God will prevail. Even when we face difficulties and spiritual battles, we know that the final victory has already been won by Christ. Michael's victory over Satan is a symbol of this eternal victory that was already assured on the cross. The example of Michael, the archangel, shows us how we should live our spiritual lives. He does not fight based on his own authority or power, but always in the name of God. This should be a model for us in our own spiritual battles. When we face temptations or difficulties, we must remember that our strength comes from God. We must not try to fight alone, but trust fully in his direction and power. The victory is not ours, but God's, and our task is simply to trust and obey. The story of Michael and Satan also reflects the ongoing struggle between good and evil in our daily lives. Although we may be tempted to act independently or rely on our own strength, true victory comes from recognizing God's supremacy. Michael, as an archangel, is a figure of spiritual authority, but he always submits to God. This model of submission is something we must learn and apply in our lives. When we recognize God's authority, he gives us the strength to win any battle. the battle over Moses, Michael's wrestling with Satan over Moses' body, and the cosmic battle described in Revelation 12 are symbols of a much larger conflict occurring in the spiritual world. This conflict is not visible to our eyes, but it is real and affects our everyday lives. The forces of evil are constantly trying to turn us away from God, but Michael reminds us that with divine authority, we can resist these temptations. God is our refuge and our strength, and we should always seek His help in times of need. Michael's life teaches us that true victory comes not from our own strength or ability, but from our total dependence on God. Even as an archangel of great power, Michael knows that his strength comes from God, not his own authority. When he fights Satan, he does so with humility and obedience, always recognizing that God is the true victor. This example of submission and trust in God is something that all Christians should learn from, as it teaches us the true source of spiritual power. As we reflect on Michael's life, spiritual struggle, and God's ultimate victory, we are called to a life of humility and submission. Just like Michael, we must submit to God's authority, recognizing that, without Him, we can do nothing. Our strength is not in our abilities or our own wisdom, but in God. Like Michael, we must fight the forces of evil with courage, but always remembering that victory has already been won by Christ. When we do this, we can live with confidence, knowing that God is faithful and that He will guide us in the battle. Michael's story also teaches us about the importance of reverence before God. Even with all his authority, Miguel did not act with arrogance or presumption. He would submit to God in all situations, recognizing that his authority was a reflection of God's authority. This is an example that we should all follow, as true spiritual strength does not come from ourselves, but from our obedience and submission to God. When we live in accordance with this truth, we can experience the peace and victory that come from being in perfect harmony with the divine will. Michael's example is also a reminder that as Christians we should not rely on our own strength or wisdom to face spiritual battles. True victory can only be achieved when we place our trust in God. When we face temptations, difficulties, or spiritual struggles, we must remember that our strength comes from God and that He is our defender. Just like Michael, we must fight in the name of God and trust that He will give us victory. Michael's battle with Satan also teaches us about the importance of resisting evil. As Christians, we are called to resist the devil and fight against his attacks, just as Michael did. However, this resistance must not be based on our own strength, but on God's authority. When we resist evil in the name of God, we can be confident that, like Michael, we will prevail. God has called us to be strong and courageous, but our strength comes from our dependence on Him. The book of Jude and the book of Revelation show us Michael as a spiritual warrior who fights for God's justice. His fight against Satan is not a battle he fights for himself, but for God and for the good of His people. This teaches us that our spiritual battles are not just personal, but are part of a larger cosmic conflict. As Christians, we must remember that we are involved in this battle, but we must also trust that, like Michael, God will give us the strength to overcome. To conclude, the story of Michael, the spiritual battle he fought against Satan, and his final victory over the forces of evil teaches us deep and valuable lessons about faith, submission, and God's authority in our lives. Michael, the most authoritative archangel in heaven, who possesses unparalleled strength and a leadership position among the angels, never acted based on his own strength or will, but always submitted to God's divine authority. Even though he was a powerful celestial being, Michael recognized that his true strength came from God and that his mission as a leader in spiritual battles was to fulfill the Lord's will, not his own. This attitude of humility and obedience teaches us that no matter how much talents and abilities we have, we must always recognize our total dependence on God and submit our lives to His direction. As Christians, we are called to follow Michael's example, learning to trust God not only when things are going well, but also in the spiritual battles we face daily. When we submit to His authority, God enables us to resist the forces of evil and gives us victory that often seems impossible to achieve in our own strength. This is a reminder that, rather than fighting alone, we should trust God, for He is the true victor in any spiritual battle. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more spiritual teachings that can transform your life and your walk with God. May God bless you and protect you, guiding your steps with His wisdom, strength, and grace, so that you can live in full submission to His will.